Hi, I'm Citizen MOFO. Today I'm going to talk about how we got to Trump. We did not become a morally and mortally sick country overnight. Trump is not a single drop of shit in an otherwise crystal clear sea of government. He is just another load of manure, an especially stinky one, dumped onto the already vast latrine that the federal government has become. His rise is the culmination of decades of rising government corruption and criminality. 5 decades, in fact, starting in 1968. 1968 is a pivotal year in American history because 5 terrible events occurred that year which changed our nation in profound ways and set us on a far darker path than our founding fathers intended. 5 drumbeats of doom, one in January, one in April, one in June, one in August, one in November. Number 1. In January came the Tet Offensive in the Vietnam War. The American people had been repeatedly assured by President Johnson and General Westmoreland that the U.S. was winning the war and degrading the enemy's capability to fight. But on January 20th, the start of the Lunar New Year celebration called Tet, 80,000 North Vietnamese troops launched surprise attacks at more than 100 towns and cities throughout South Vietnam. This included Saigon, the capital, where NVA commandos blasted their way into the U.S. Embassy and held it for 6 hours. The Tet Offensive was the largest military operation of the war to that point. Shortly before it happened, General Westmoreland had assured the nation that the enemy was, quote, unable to mount a major offensive, unquote. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a major defeat for the North Vietnamese, but it was a far worse disaster for the U.S. in terms of public support for the war. It threw open the kimono, revealing to the American people that the government had been lying all along about the war in all its various aspects. Anti-war protests in the U.S. had already been growing in size and vehemence, and Tet turbocharged protesters across the nation. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, who had reported the body counts every night on the CBS Evening News for years, like sports scores, now came out publicly against the war. Martin Luther King Jr. began to speak out against the war as well. Which takes us to number 2. On April 3, 1968, MLK delivered his I Had Been to the Mountaintop speech at the Mason Temple in Memphis, Tennessee, in support of the striking sanitation workers. It is one of the most beautiful and powerful speeches ever to grace the earth. It is also dark with the prophecy of his own death. That prophecy came true the very next day, on April 4th, when MLK was assassinated as he stood on the balcony of his room at the Lorraine Motel. That day, America lost a clear voice of reason and eloquence and the true American dream of justice and equality and basic decency for all people, a voice which has only been equaled by one other American, and that is Abraham Lincoln. MLK was an apostle of peace, leading a widespread movement of nonviolent resistance in the face of unbridled white nationalist viciousness that came at them as fire hoses, attack dogs, threats of lynching, etc. Looking back on Martin's achievement from our present state of pervasive violence, we need to understand how much we lost when we lost MLK. Here's Bobby Kennedy, that same night of April 4th, delivering the news of MLK's assassination to an audience in Indianapolis.
And people who love peace all over the world, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee.
Number 3. Just 2 months later, on June 5th, Bobby himself would be assassinated just after winning the California primary in the 1968 presidential election. Like Martin, he was a voice of reason and eloquence and justice and peace and compassion. Erudite and fond of quoting poetry in his speeches, but also tough, not afraid to call out America on its hypocrisies, and a sincere warrior for racial justice in a time when most were not. Had Bobby not been killed, it is likely, in my view, that he would have defeated Nixon for the presidency. So Bobby's loss is simply incalculable. We'll get to Nixon in a moment. But first, number 4. The 1968 Democratic Convention was held August 26th to 29th in Chicago, and it quickly became a spectacle of violently suppressed protests. That summer of 1968 had been one of endless upheaval, with riots in more than 100 cities throughout the nation after MLK's death. But the riot in Chicago was a police riot. 23,000 police and National Guardsmen met 10,000 protesters in Grant Park with tear gas and clubs and beat the shit out of them with unrestrained glee while the nation watched, and in many cases cheered. Mayor Daley of Chicago, who had engineered the violence, said he had received 135,000 letters supporting the police violence and only 5,000 condemning it. It can be said that Chicago '68 was the harbinger of the Kent State Massacre less than 2 years later on May 4th, 1970. Thus, with MLK's and Bobby's voices of justice, peace, and decency silenced, the American people began to turn away from these qualities and from the protections of the Constitution and surrender their trust to a government that had proven itself untrustworthy on one of the most important things it does, war and the sacrifice of young Americans. If the government cannot be trusted about the whys and wherefores of sending soldiers to foreign lands to kill and be killed, then it can be trusted about nothing. Which brings us to number 5. We've come to the election of Richard Nixon on November 5th, the last major catastrophe of the year. It was one of the closest elections in American history. Nixon won with only 43.42% of the vote, beating Hubert Humphrey by a mere 500,000 votes. With MLK gone, with Bobby gone, we were left with Nixon, a voice of division, of injustice, of mendacity, of corruption, a man who perceived enemies everywhere and used any means possible, whether legal or not, to attack and defeat them. In short, our most criminal president to date. Nixon left a legacy of destruction from which our country has yet to emerge. He set in motion the wheels of injustice in our government that have accelerated over the last 5 decades, leading, perhaps inevitably, to the national shame that is Trump in the White House. Nixon's legacy of destruction has not flowed out of Watergate, but out of the war on drugs, of which he is the founding father. Thus, beat by beat, from Tet in January to MLK in April, to Bobby in June, to Chicago in August, to Nixon in November, 1968 became a pivotal year in American history that changed us in dark and profound ways. It was the year America lost its soul. I will address the topic of the war on drugs in detail in my next video, and why it's been so devastating for America, because it is an extraordinarily important topic. Please stay tuned. Thanks.